Hey animators, I'm going to try to replace the missing lecture from yesterday with all the information here. So what I want you to do is give this a watch and we'll try to continue from this place tomorrow. That way we don't have too much redundancy. So what I'd like to do is start off by looking at Maya and looking at the bouncing ball rig and looking at the animation portion of Maya. So here's the bouncing ball file, or just the ball rig, and I'd like to go ahead and go to workspaces and come here and trigger the animation workspace. And you'll see what that does is it gives us right here the graph editor. And the graph editor, I've said before, is a very critical part of animation, not just Maya, but all digital animation platforms. You'll find this in Toon Boom, you'll find it in After Effects, anything where you need to control performance or rate of change. And so anyways, and then down here we should all recognize this portion. The timeline is probably shorter on yours, but here it is. I have it enlarged just so we can see it well. And this timeline we can click and drag and it responds, like most timelines that we're used to. And so the next bit I'm going to introduce right here, it's probably actually looks more like this. There's probably a 1 here. Is that this is the actual time slider and work. We'll call this the work area, right? And so there's 4 numbers here, right? And let me just tell you what these numbers describe. First, this is the first number in the or the first frame in the animation. So usually it's set to 1. I'm actually going to change that to 0, and then put this to 0 as well. And so over here, this is the last frame, 100. Okay, so when I push play, you'll see that it plays through the animation 0 to 100, 0 to 100 over and over and over and over again. So what if I just want to review portions of the animation? Maybe I want to review the first second of animation, the first 24 frames. So I'm going to type that number in here, 24. What you can see is it limits this work area right here. So now we can see all 24 frames, and I push play and it cycles through those frames, right? So this is how we would just rewatch one portion to either review the arcs or review the weight or certain elements in scrutiny. And so aside from manually keying in the number, I can adjust the numbers right here with the time with this work area slider. So I can drag the outside. You can see it changes these values over here, and then I can drag and move the entire work area. So if I move it out here and push play, then all of a sudden it gives me just playback of that area. Okay, so next, another bit I want to show you is this part down here. I guess we'll call this the little guy running from the gear of death, right? Here it comes. And so if we click this little icon, what it does is it takes us into the animation preferences, or specifically the time slider preferences. And what I want you to change here is, this is by default the way playback happens in Maya. It says play every frame, and what that does is it just takes every frame of the animation and it plays it back as fast as the hardware will push it, which is just it's not a consistent speed. So I want to change that to 24 frames per second, right? That changes, it makes it to where it plays back at only 1 rate. Okay, we need that for animation. And the other bit is I want you to come here to animation preferences, and if this isn't set to weighted tangents, set this to weighted tangents, okay, and click save. So that is just the exact same preferences that we can access, from other ways in Maya, but this button right here takes us exactly to the animation preferences. Very handy to use. Okay, so now let's take a look at the actual bouncing ball rig. Okay, so here it is, and as you can see, it has this controller around it. This makes it kind of like Goon in the sense that on the Goon rig, it has that main home plate controller that manipulates the volume, moves and rotates the main volume of the character. And so anywhere from a large rig like Goon all the way to a simple rig like the bouncing ball, you'll see that there's always this main controller. And when we select that, we get the controls that were typical, translate XYZ, rotate XYZ, and then a few extra ones that the riggers put in here for us. And so I'll explain these controls in a second, but these are our standard controls that we'll see in the channel box, okay? And so now what I'd like to do is I want to look at the animation not from the perspective window. What I want to do is I'm going to hit spacebar, and I want to change over to the front Z. Okay, so this is an orthographic view. And so an orthographic view is devoid of depth. I mean, it does not have a Z axis, so It is truly 2D animation, and it's like a big piece of graph paper, right? And so this is where we'll be animating it first, because again, our intent is to port in your animation skills that you already have and see if we can get those firing inside Maya, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off very simple in 2D. So as we know, we can translate X, we can move the ball left to right, and we can translate Y, we can move it up and down. Translate Z, you'll see again it does nothing, so we'll leave that there. And so now what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the squash and stretch of the ball. So what you'll notice here is the squash and stretch controls. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to create another sphere. Okay, so here is just a generic sphere, right? You can see that this is what the bouncing ball is built from. And so when thinking about squash and stretch, I'm going to tap R, which gives us our scale tool, and I'm going to scale this on the Y. You can see it getting larger over here in the channel box, right? So there is, I guess, hypothetically a stretch pose, but let's take a look at the rig, and let's do an actual squash or stretch. Okay, so you can see there, I'm going to go ahead and set this. I think your squash pivot is going to be already set to 1. So let me set that to 1 and try that again. All right, so here comes the stretch. And as you can see, really it's a much more intelligent stretch. And it feels a lot more gummy, and it has a lot more character and appeal to the way that it's deforming. If I come back here and I do the exact same motion, you can see that just like, especially the way it squashes, it's not squashing, it's scaling, and it loses volume and all appeal. So that's really what the benefit of the stretch controls are, is that it's an artist-directed decision as to how things deform and shape, and so that's how we control the style of the squash and stretch in a film or an animation. And so from there, what I want to start looking at is the squash pivot. So the squash pivot is, in animation we have many pivots, right? So this is the origin that we rotate around and translate from. And so as you'll notice, when I squash and stretch like this, we're squashing and stretching from the center, right? That belt around the waist of the ball. So what I'd like to do is take this squash pivot and middle mouse scrub and move it down to 0, and look at and see what that does to the squash and stretch. So now as I'm doing, you can see that I'm squashing and stretching from the base, right? This will allow us to create the illusion of contact, right? So let me explain a little bit about that. So as animators, we are responsible for the contact in a shot, meaning this line right here, this 0 line across the bottom, this represents the floor. And so if our animation comes to bounce and it is slightly above the floor, when it renders in the final animation, even if it looks fine just perceptually, when it renders, the shadow won't render correctly. It's called occlusion, where the actual geometry touches, and so there won't be a convincing the illusion will fail when the shadows appear that the ball is 2 inches above the ground, right? So as an animator, it's our responsibility to actually create the traction and friction. So for most rigs, this goes for the legs of like Goon and some other ones. If you tap it to 0 or set the Y to 0, it generally will either return it to its origin or snap it to the floor. So that's handy. We know that the floor is always 0 with this rig, okay? And so that allows the squash and stretch to really, we can squash and stretch from the floor, right? So we can come in and be like this right before impact, and then come in and impact like that, and do less animation to create this illusion. And so now what we can do is we can move the squash pivot to the top of the rig. So we move it to 2, right? 1 is in the center and 2 is at the top. So now when we squash and stretch, it squashes and stretches from the top. So you can see how we can do a collision with the ceiling, or if the rig gets turned around, really we can align this to whatever we need, okay? And so next we can rotate the ball by rotating the Z, but what you can see is if I come out here, rotating on the Z actually rotates the entire rig. It rotates the controller and everything. So what Kevin has done is he's actually built this to where there's a command in there that rolls within the rig. It's called roll ball. So this is how we'll actually roll the ball when we create the bouncing ball. You can see it keeps our control node right there centered. And so that'll also give it a different relationship with the squash and the stretch. Let me show you this. So as we're creating our arcs and creating our animation, let's move our squash pivot down to 0 so it's at the bottom. Now let's give it a little bit of squash and stretch, okay? And so from here, I really want you to look at is this little dot right here is actually an indicator of where the rotate, squash, and stretch is positioned. So if I take this and I rotate the pivot, it angles it like that, and now I introduce some squash and stretch. Now you can see that it's making the, it's giving the squash and the stretch, the angle of the actual pivot. And so we can change, and really what it's allowing us to do is distort the model in as many ways as possible to give us the flexibility we need to create whatever animation we need to create. So with the bouncing ball, the action is pretty limited, but you do want to scurry it around and deform it to where we can create all the drawings necessary for what animation we're going to make. So a lot of that is more advanced than we'll get into in this session, but it does give you the idea that even this simple ball has some pretty nice capabilities built into it. So I'm going to zero this out, and I'm going to go ahead and put the squash pivot back to 1. And so now what I want to do is I want to start easing into animation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make the timeline 90. So it's 90 full frames, and then I'm going to start off with a work area of 24. Okay, just to look at the first second. So now I'm going to select the ball, and there's a few ways to set keys, and there's a few ways to interact with them. So let me start off with just the most generic way. So I'm going to come up here and we're going to start to look at an actual ball bounce. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type in 20, and this moves it 20 units up towards the top of the frame. So I'm going to zoom out and see it. Okay, so here it is floating above ground. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here. First I'm going to go ahead and put my time slider on 0. Okay, so here we are at frame 0, and I'm going to right click here and click key selected. Okay, what it does, you'll notice it gives us a red tick mark, and it introduces this channel down here into the graph editor. Okay, so with this channel down in the graph editor, now we have set a key. That's this little guy, this little orange dot. So we can select it, and all of a sudden the stats, we can see it here. This correlates with the channel box. So 0 is the time and 20 is the value. So as we look at this graph right here, the way you look at it is left to right, this XY or this X dimension on the graph, this indicates time, and you can see it runs up here just in the same units that we see down on the actual timeline. And then the up and down, the Y of this graph is the value. So you can see here is 20. So this key is lying at 0 and 20. And if I select it, it shows us the stats right here. Okay. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to frame 16, and I'm going to zero out the translate Y. And one thing you'll notice is that it turns this this value, this little box, this peachy color, which indicates that there is change on this, but there's not been a key set. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and click key selected, and you'll see it turns it red. Okay, and so that means that there's another key, and here's the other one. So there's 2 keys. I'm going to go ahead and flatten these out just to where it's what's considered a linear animation, just straightforward, and we'll take a look at this. So let's go ahead and hit play. It's nothing too exciting, but it is our very first animation, right? There it is, the ball's moving along. It has no appeal and no real thought to it, but it is the first step. So you can see that the rate of change is the same. As I manipulate the timeline, it marches along at the same increment each time. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the ball. Duplicate. All right, so now we have 2 balls. All right, and so I'm going to reapply the same animation. So I'm going on at 0, I'm going to change this to 20. All right, I'm going to right click and key select. It gives me the red tick mark. I come here to 16. I change this to 0. It gives me the peachy one, so I give it the key selected, and that gives me my second key. So now we have this track of animation. All right, so here's what this one looks like. It has these curves on it, okay? These tangents that soften the graph. Let's compare it to the first one. There we go, straight line versus a softer line. And so this is an ease out and this is an ease in, or a slow out and a slow in. And what you see is the rate of change from 0 to 1, it doesn't change much, and then it changes more and more as it goes along. And then the opposite. So let's give this a watch and see how it differs. Okay, so you can see quite easily right here. As it starts, you know, the linear ball on the left rockets along and gets moving, whereas the ball on the right takes time to pick up momentum, and then it eventually passes and almost goes to the end and then eases in. So we're starting to see a simulation of weight. This is the difference between timing and spacing, right? How the ball gets from here to there. So you can see that this is a more educated decision, but this really is not what I'm looking for exactly. So let's go ahead and delete this and go back to the original ball. I'm going to go ahead and take these elements right here, and I'm going to click here for auto spline, which just gives us these auto tangents, right? These tangent handles. This is kind of like Illustrator. I don't know if you guys are super familiar with Illustrator, but this is a lot of the way you interface with the graphics. There are these handles that manipulate the curve. So I can click here and I can drag this out and change the rate of change, right? Look at all these, you know, available ideas that we can do. So if I pull it out here and then I click this one and I pull it out here, what you're seeing is a massive ease out. Like it starts out slow and then it really speeds up and then it slows down. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we're starting to see really how this works and how it correlates to you know, the on-screen performance correlates to, you know, the shape of the graph. You know, we'll get to know these graphs over time. You'll start to understand just by looking at it if something has too much acceleration, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. And so really what we're seeing here is it works here because you know, it's this nice slow out, but this slow in right here is an impossibility. There's no way that the ball can slow before it hits the ground, right? What you're seeing here is Newton's law at work. That's objects at rest tend to stay at rest until acted on by an outside force. That's what it is up here. It's at rest, and then when we hit play, what's happening is it's being acted upon by gravity, right? We're animating on planet Earth. That's where this ball exists, so it has to respond to gravity. So it speeds up, and it's moving quickly. But right here, we really need it to strike the ground hard. So I'm going to take this handle, and I'm going to pitch it up like this. You can see that as I manipulate this, it's changing the animation. I'm going to land it right here. I'm going to go ahead and pull this one back a little bit just to soften it. And now I'm going to play, and what we should feel is we should feel an acceleration from point A, and then you know, an outright stop on frame 16. You know, the beginning will feel natural, but at the end will feel a little bit disjointed. There we go. So now what we really need is the equal and opposite reaction. Another Newton law. What we really need is we need the ball to strike the ground and reflect off. So let's take a look at how to do that. I'm going to go ahead and open up the workspace a little bit more. Pull it out to 30 frames. And so from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set another keyframe. I'll come down to about 27. Again, you don't have to use these values exactly. In fact, please don't. Use other values. There's no virtue to using round numbers and copying numbers exactly. It's all about, you know, the feel. So as far as the timing goes, you know, what frames the bounces land on, things like that. Do what works for you, because there's, you know, there is 1,000 ways to animate the ball in different sensibilities, right? We do want a kind of a lightweight ball, not a feather light ball, but just a light ball, I'd say. So at 27, really what I'm looking at is I need the next key. This is going to be where the ball goes back up. And so two things change about when the ball strikes the ground. The ball, because it strikes the ground, it loses some of its inertia, so it bounces less high, right? It doesn't go up as high, and then the amount of time it takes to get there decays as well. So if you look at this first animation, 0 to 16, I'm looking at that as a half bounce. And so now we want to go up to the top again. That's another half bounce. So the first one was 16 and this is 27. So that's an 11 frame half bounce. Okay, so it goes from 16 to 11. Not only are the values going to get smaller, but the time range is going to get smaller. So let me go ahead and come up here, and I'm going to move this one up to somewhere around 12. Right, the first value was 20. I'm going to go up to 12.2. Right, key selected. Now we see I'm going to tap F to frame it, and frame the curve. And now we see down here that the graph actually runs under here. We see an extreme on 18. Let's go ahead and push play. This is not what we're looking for, but hopefully we can see, you know, learn something from what this looks like. Push play and it eases out, and it kind of slingshots back in. It has this big ease on the bottom side, which is not what we want. We call that's an unwanted overshoot, right? The key should be on the extreme, right? This 0 on 16 is the extreme. So what we got to get rid of is this ability that's what's pushing the tangent down through the floor plane here. So what I want to do is I want to click this button, which is break tangents. And what you see is it gives us this dotted line, and now the tangents act independently from each other. So now you can see we get a snappy change in motion. So let's go ahead and push play on this from 0 and see where it lands. There we go. Okay, so much more convincing, right? And so at this point, what we can do is we can create, we can really polish the nuances of exactly the momentum at which it strikes and leaves, and hit play and watch. Okay, that's looking good. I like that. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to come down and I want to add in the next half bounce, it coming back down. So we went from 16 to 27, that's 11 frames, so I'm going to go from 27 to 38. Lengthen this work area right here. Type in 0 and translate Y. And then I need to set it in place. So if I don't set the key right there and I move the playhead, it just snaps back to where it was. It's this consistent value. This channel holds right at 12.2 unless I trigger another change. So again, I go from 27 to 38. Drop the ball to the floor with 0 and key selected. And you see now it gives it this ease in, which is not what we want. We want another hard hit. So now I'm going to revise it like this, and I'm going to push play. There. Excellent, 2 bounces. I feel like that's working nicely. So I'm going to continue downstream. I'm going to open this up a little bit more, and we're going to look for the next half bounce. So what we do is, so each time, again, we're decaying. When you look at this half bounce, we went from 16 frames to 11. So now let's drop to 10. So from 38, let's go to 48. And I'm going to take it up from, last time I believe it was around 12 or so, maybe take it up to 8. So, and now let's right click into key selected again. Experiment, find other values that work, look for other sensibilities. The fact that this is recorded and you can follow it, please don't let that be a crutch. That's not what we're looking for. So again, this is not the tangent we're looking for. This is nice for the top. It gives us this nice smooth curve, but down here it's giving us unwanted overshoot. So again, we're going to break this tangent and we're going to pitch it up like this, and that's going to create the momentum that we want. As you can see, this is another reason that it's nice to bounce the ball, because this curve just happens to actually look like the action that we're animating. So it's kind of a lightweight ask of the animator to really animate that. That's why we can really visualize it and make this our first assignment. Okay, so this is a 10 frame half bounce, so it needs to be followed by a 10 frame half bounce. I'm going to go to 58, and I'm going to show you another cute shortcut. So now that we're starting to see the pattern that's rising here, I can select this key by drawing a box around it, and Control C and then Control V, I can just paste it. So now we can see that we're getting more and more, compounded efforts. Let's watch. Okay, the last bit feels like the ball's almost slamming down, so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to ease off of this a little bit and ease off of this. Again, if it's not quite as harsh of an angle in the graph editor, it will soften the animation, and that's really what I want you to start to develop, is the relationship between on-screen momentum and what's happening in the graph editor. I like that. All right, so next up, so that was a 10 frame half bounce to 60. So, or rather to 58. So now let's go to 64, a 6 frame half bounce, and you start to see a trend here. Let's pull it up and let's hit key selected. And so what you can also notice is that I set a key and I want to immediately change it. What I could do is I'm going to highlight this and tap F, and you can see that I can click and I can manipulate the key here, so I can pull it up, and that's changing the value of the animation right there. And you can see that the animation is responding right there on screen, and the channel box is updating as well, and the stats over on the left, they're all responding to that. So that's one real-time way to change the values. So if I wanted to change this value with the channel box, so if I wanted to make it a 3, I would type in 3, and it would require me still to key selected. But if I change it over here in this active view of the keys, so if I change it from 3 to 3.5, it automatically updates, and I don't have to run the key selected again. Okay, so that's just different ways of interacting with the animation yield different results. So again, I'm going to move it up again, and anytime you know that you need to set a key is when you see it peachy and you want it locked in. Okay, so I'm going to hit key selected, and then I'm going to tap F in here just to even out this unwanted overshoot. I'm going to bring this down. And then so from 64, I'm going to go up to 70. And then I'm going to paste this key right here again. All right, look at it, and there's an unwanted overshoot. I'm going to clean this up. And it's kind of rinse and repeat at this point. You're really starting to get the idea of the animation, I think. And so next, we want to, now we've gotten through the main bounces, what we want to start getting into are kind of the residual die-off bounces. Again, the curves are compressing together and then we're also getting smaller. So now it's like a boom, 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 like those last kind of drown out ones is what we want to look at. So from here, again, 64 to 70, that's a 6 frame half bounce. Let's go to 74. We're going to lengthen this work area, go out to 74, and I'm going to move it up and key selected. It didn't go quite high enough. I'm just going to look at it. I know I want it to not go up as high as on frame 64, so we'll go about right here. Manipulate this. I'm going to go up to 70, 78. And again, I'm going to copy and paste that here. I believe that this value still needs to come down a little bit. We'll do that. Changing this, you can see I'm manipulating it more and more without, playback, just because I'm starting to anticipate what I want to see. Now we're going to go for yet another half bounce. So we're going to 4 frame half bounce. Let's go ahead and go 3 frame. We'll go up to 81. And the time is really compressing. So these are those like quick staccato moments. But this is where the animation really sells as far as the actual decay. I'm going to key select it. And I'm just going to move this guy up about right there. Moving in again. I'm tapping F and moving around. Oh, and I hope I explained this, but the way that we're interacting with the graph editor down here, it does interact like the viewport. I hold Alt and I middle mouse click around, and that allows me to pan, same as up here. And then I can zoom by middle mouse clicking and or middle Alt and right mouse clicking allows me to zoom, exact same as up here. So the viewport and the graph editor, they have similar methods of interaction. Tap F, 81 to 84. Zero it out, drops to the ground. I'm going to key selected, bring it here, 84 to 86. Let's make it a 2 frame half bounce. These are the little real lightweight ones. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that and put it there, bring it down, break this tangent, move, break the tangent, move it up. Come to 88, and I'm going to zero it out again. Key selected. Still working on these little moments. Again, really make no mistake, the animation, like the name of the game in animation is detail. Detail, detail. It's like capture these tiny moments, they sell the bigger moments. It's true. All right, so 88 to 89. To 90, let's put in the smallest bounce. I'm going to go ahead and give us a few more frames. So 88 to 89. Let's go ahead and this is that 1 frame tiny little bounce. Put it in. There's a bloop, beep. Key selected. At this point, the in-betweens don't even much matter. 0. We'll go ahead and shape these curves anyways, because there is no real method of change in here because it's just 1 frame. I see all these fractions. There's no such thing as a half frame. I'm gonna break the tangent. Just do it for the fun of it. Again, I can hit F and really zoom in on this, so you can see now we're changing the trajectory and the easing of such a tiny moment. But that is the gift of CG, is that we can really get in here and decide these tiny moments. Okay, so there's the whole thing. I'm going to zoom out, I'm going to return the playhead to 0, and we're going to watch the animation. So some of these bounces, one of these, it's that one. One of them feels a little bit off, so I feel like I can come in here and really tweak these. I think it's maybe this bounce right here. Maybe this one lightens a little bit. You can see exactly you know, how I can manipulate each one of these to just polish them together to where they all feel like they're truly, you know, the bounce that came next, you know, gauged the bounce that came, gauged from the bounce that came before. And so now, you know, this is the beginning of the animation, and I did just want to get through this and get this into your brain. We'll revisit this, and we'll start to put into motion, you know, the translate X and the roll ball and some of the other features. But this is really the initial exposure to Maya animation. And so here's one last shortcut I want to leave with you, is that period and comma will skip between keys. And let me show you what that means. So I'm going to go back to 0, which I'm parked on a red key right here. So if I tap the period key, it advances to the next key, and then to the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. And so what this really does is this shows you the timing, right, where the ball is at the extremes, and it ignores all of the spacing, right, how it gets from here to there, the easing and stuff. So it's a quick way to shuffle through it and minimize the animation to a blocking sense, to where you can see just the, you know, the placement and some of the timing. It allows you to almost flip through the animation. Okay, so I hope that's a strong introduction. I'm sure I missed something, and we'll cover it again later, but this should get us rolling. Again, help me recover from the network being down. I really want to keep momentum in the class, so let's work together. Thanks, guys.